Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving headfirst into a really fascinating structural evaluation of the global financial system. We're going to trace its lineage all the way from the Federal Reserve's deeply guarded origins to the modern geopolitical rise of digital currencies. If you've ever wondered how the mechanics of global financial power actually operate beneath the surface, well, you're in exactly the right place. Let's just jump right in.
To keep us perfectly structured today, our agenda follows a chronological arc across 5 distinct eras: the architecture of finance, the Jekyll Island blueprint, birth of the petrodollar, threat of fiscal dominance, and finally, bypassing the dollar.
Starting with Section 1, the architecture of finance, evaluating the foundations. Let's look at the exact methodology the paper uses to analyze the deeply guarded history of American central banking. The evaluation actually applies what they call a critical realist lens to financial history, and it introduces this concept that's absolutely crucial to understand: epistemic camouflage. Essentially, the argument is that institutional elites intentionally use extreme, mind-numbing institutional complexity and dense economic jargon to hide how financial power actually operates. By making the whole system look like this neutral, highly technical macroeconomic management, they effectively shut out the public and reserve the conversation strictly for credentialed experts. Okay, moving into Section 2, the Jekyll Island blueprint, drafting the Federal Reserve. Let's strip away some of that camouflage and look at the origins of the Fed.
According to the analysis, the structural blueprint for the Fed wasn't drafted in the public halls of Congress. No, it was drafted in absolute secrecy in 1910. We're talking about a cartel of the most powerful private bankers in the country gathering at the exclusive Jekyll Island Club, even traveling under assumed names. The result of this covert meetup was the Aldrich Plan. Now, it was technically sophisticated, sure, but it was politically toxic because it essentially handed legal control of the nation's money directly to a Wall Street syndicate.
Openly adopting the Aldrich Plan would have been total political suicide during the Progressive Era. So the architects executed a masterful pivot, illustrating what the source brilliantly calls political laundering. You see, the core mechanics of the Aldrich Plan were kept exactly the same in the new bill, but the governance completely repackaged. It was structurally transformed into the Federal Reserve Act, looking like a public-private hybrid, with regional banks overseen by a public board in Washington. It looked decentralized, but that banker-designed engine remained fully intact. This quote from the evaluation sums it up perfectly, noting that the final Federal Reserve System was a masterclass in political compromise, perfectly tailored to survive political sensitivities while serving Wall Street. The source points out that admitting this private, banker-designed lineage actually fundamentally undermines the modern mythology of a completely independent, neutral central bank. Let's trace this on a timeline. The original Federal Reserve was constrained by gold, right? Under the 1944 Bretton Woods system, the world pegged to the dollar, and the dollar was pegged to physical gold. But as we move toward 1971 on this timeline, you can see that system was heading for a mathematical breaking point. And that breaking point is known as the Triffin dilemma. Think about the mathematical inevitability here. For the global economy to grow, the world needed an ever-increasing supply of US dollars. To pump those out, the US had to run massive deficits. But eventually, those outstanding paper dollars vastly outnumbered the actual physical gold sitting in Fort Knox. Foreign nations started demanding their gold back. Facing an imminent run on the bank, President Nixon was forced to execute the Nixon shock in 1971, completely severing that gold constraint. Welcome to the pure fiat currency era.
Section 3. Birth of the petrodollar, re-anchoring the system. With the gold anchor suddenly gone, the evaluation details how a new system was urgently needed.
The source argues that a highly covert 1974 mission to Saudi Arabia established a brilliant new anchor, the petrodollar loop. It's a 3-step process. First, Saudi Arabia agreed to price all its crude oil exclusively in US dollars, which mathematically forced every single energy importing nation to hold dollars. Second, Saudi Arabia recycled those massive new petrodollar profits right back into US Treasury securities, effectively financing the American deficit. And third, in exchange, the US provided ironclad military protection. The dollar was no longer backed by gold, it was backed by global energy demand and the US military. And here we see another incredible instance of epistemic camouflage. King Faisal of Saudi Arabia demanded absolute secrecy for this deal to avoid geopolitical backlash. So, to hide the fact that Saudi oil money was financing the US government, the Treasury created a backdoor. They deliberately obfuscated Saudi debt holdings by grouping them under a generic oil exporters category in public reports.
This completely hid the true mechanics of the petrodollar loop from the world for an astounding 41 years.
Bringing us to the present day with Section 4, Threat of Fiscal Dominance, Reaching Mathematical Limits. We're looking at the devastating consequences as this architecture finally breaks down. The crucial takeaway here is this absolutely staggering figure, $16 trillion. That's the estimate for what the United States will have to borrow over the next decade purely to service the interest payments on existing debt. Just the interest. The petrodollar system allowed massive deficits for half a century, but the math is finally catching up.
The evaluation warns that this massive debt burden leads directly into an economic state called fiscal dominance. This is when the debt becomes so huge that the central bank can't fight inflation anymore. Instead, the Fed is mathematically forced to step in, artificially suppress interest rates, and effectively monetize the government's debt to prevent a default. The source calls this financial repression, where the debt is literally inflated away at your expense. Every single time you see prices rise at the grocery store, you are experiencing the downstream effects of this exact mechanism.
Finally, Section 5. Bypassing the dollar, the alternative infrastructure. The paper assesses the future, evaluating existential technological threats to dollar hegemony. For 50 years, the petrodollar loop relied on the SWIFT network, but the analysis points to a new vanguard, Project M-Bridge. This is a revolutionary wholesale central bank digital currency platform. It allows central banks to execute real-time, cross-border payments directly in their own local currencies. Built on distributed ledger technology, it completely, 100%, bypasses the US-controlled SWIFT system. It's a direct technological mechanism to route entirely around American financial plumbing.
And the geopolitical tectonic plates shifted big time in June 2024 when Saudi Arabia officially joined Project M-Bridge as a full participant. This bridges Saudi Arabia, the world's top energy exporter, with China, the world's top importer, on a blockchain-based rail that simply does not require the US dollar. Nations now have a highly efficient, viable infrastructure to trade oil without being forced to hold American currency.
So as our explainer concludes today, the source leaves us with this incredibly provocative reality. The entire system was built to manage global capital and finance US deficits through a forced reliance on the dollar. But if technological bypasses like M-Bridge remove that forced reliance, who is going to buy the $16 trillion of debt required just to keep the lights on? How will this architecture survive the weight of its own creation? It's a massive question that really redefines our understanding of global finance. Thank you so much for joining me, and keep questioning the architecture around you.